upcoming book. I have an upcoming book that is available for pre-order on Amazon, and it is called Preaching Funerals. It is essentially my demon work. So it's a practical guide to helping those of us who specifically preach funerals for people we don't know very well. I mean, you can use it for anyone, but it helps guide that, so you won't have to get up there and say, I didn't know the person, so I'm just going to preach. I've been to too many funerals where the clergy say that, and that's just embarrassing. And so it's very practical. It is released in October 1. So please pick it up. I think it'll be helpful. So I teach adjunct at several institutions. I teach queer womanist preaching, African American preaching and worship, gender, sexuality, and theology. In the fall, I'm teaching Intro to Pastoral Care. I've spent over a decade as a hospice chaplain as well. And so my writing is kind of all over the place. I write about pedagogies. I write about womanist preaching. I write about queer womanist preaching. And so I just try to be a practitioner scholar and do the work that my soul must have. And so that's a little bit about me. This keynote lecture, the title is The Pedagogies of Persuasion, Using Rhetorical Theology to Discuss the Politics of Sex and Sexuality. The First Amendment of the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Characterized as the separation of church and state, the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion. There are numerous ways that the separation of church and state is enacted in governance. For example, a church risks losing their nonprofit status if found endorsing political candidates. But in spite of this presumable separation, politicians have used religion to persuade public policy by shaping moral arguments that guide legislative policies. And these policies impact the daily realities of everyone living in the United States and beyond. The confluence of religious doctrine, public theology, and public policy is explored in theoretical theology, or rhetorical theology. Rhetorical theology is God talk grounded in the context of lived experience that produces constructs of God concerned about the practical implications of religious doctrine. The purpose of rhetorical theology is to create a God consciousness that promotes communal wholeness. Rhetorical theology examines theological perspectives through the lens of four assumptions: faithful persuasion, implications of the doctrine, contextuality, and the invitation of the rhetor. In this lecture, first I survey the scholarship on rhetorical theology. Then I explain how I use rhetorical theology in graduate level courses to promote critical thinking during discussions of the politics of sex and sexuality. And lastly, I conclude with several observations resulting from the case study in theological education. So the scholarship on rhetorical theology. Rhetorical theology is a term coined by Andre Johnson in the article The Prophetic Persona of James Cone and the Rhetorical Theology of Black Theology. Johnson argues that Black theology moved from the margins to the center in an attempt to acquiesce in the academy, thus shifting from a rhetorical theology that emphasizes the practical implications of doctrine towards a systematic theology that attempts to categorize theological pillars into strict, narrowly defined, often Eurocentric frameworks. For Johnson, the shift made Black liberation theology less relevant because the focus shifted to theory, which then imposes that theory onto the lived text, the actual lives of Black persons. While rhetorical theology maintains that theory can be derived from method, it comes to the rhetorical task seeking guidance and understanding from the lived text rather than imposing theoretical concepts upon the lived text. So in order to remain relevant, Johnson argues that all theology must take a rhetorical turn, including Black liberation theology, to return to the rhetorical theology that centers the lived realities of Black people. In an essay, Avoiding Phony Religiosity, the Rhetorical Theology of Obama's 2012 National Prayer Breakfast Address, Johnson identifies the rhetorical theology in President Obama's speech. Obama attempts to address two problems, according to Johnson: the upcoming 2012 election and a personal theology that contradicts the dominating theological perspective of people of faith being against abortion, against the LGBTQIA community, and against women's rights. Throughout the speech, Obama shapes a theological discourse on values, not exclusively American or Christian values, more so universal values concerned with the well-being of all people. Therefore, Obama constructs a public theology that is relational, empathetic, cares for the poor, and one that stands with those of the margins of society. The relational advocacy based on universal values makes Obama's public theology a rhetorical theology that centers the implications of belief on the lives of real people. In the article, God is a Negro, the Rhetorical Black Theology of Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, Johnson argues that Bishop Henry McNeil Turner uses rhetorical theology in his sermon delivered on October 27, 1895 at Friendship Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, where he is infamously known as saying, "God is a Negro." The imagery of God as a Negro emphasizes the contextual reality of African Americans, thus providing empowering God talk as a rhetoric of resistance in response to white supremacy. Turner challenges the notions of God due to the pathological dangers for Black people in viewing God from within the prism of white supremacy. Since all theology is an argument of persuasion, God is a Negro demonstrates how rhetorical theology situates the context of African Americans using the construction of God as a site of liberation. Lastly, in his book, God of the Dangerous Sermon, Frank A. Thomas furthers Johnson's scholarship regarding a relevant theology centering the lived realities of people. Thomas identifies his personal theology as a rhetorical theology with the following 5 characteristics. 1, it has an aversion to absolutism. 2, its theory arises from practice. 3, it values right behavior over right doctrine. 4, its view of religion is concerned with personal salvation and social transformation. And 5, it encourages tools for social analysis and activism. In my own work on rhetorical theology, I argue that the pastor Howard John Wesley uses rhetorical theology to engage dialogue about sex, sexuality, and scripture in his church. In the article, The Persona of the Humble Teacher, a rhetorical theory to engage in dialogue about sexuality in the church, I examine Wesley's adoption of the humble teacher persona while presenting a rhetorical theology in a Bible study at Alfred Street Baptist Church. Based on the implications of doctrine, Wesley challenges the treatment of the LGBTQIA+ community in his church and beyond. The challenge is based on the higher ideals of the Christian faith, such as love, Imago Dei, and unity. The higher ideals point toward the faith claim that Christians must learn to live with difference. Wesley does not necessarily want to change people's theological beliefs. The question that Wesley asks is, do members of the LGBTQIA+ community feel loved at Alfred Street Baptist Church? And if the answer is no, then how do we as a Christian community better demonstrate that Christian value of love? So based on my own work on the persona of the humble teacher, I developed a pedagogical approach to engage topics of sexuality in the classroom using rhetorical theology to encourage critical thinking. Now, I define rhetorical theology as God talk grounded in the context of lived experience that produces constructs of God concerned about the practical implications of religious doctrine. Again, the purpose of rhetorical theology is to create a God consciousness that promotes communal wholeness. And when we consider the 4 assumptions within this pedagogical framework, Faithful persuasion involves presenting multiple perspectives on a given issue in ways that move listeners toward deeper insight and understanding. The implications of doctrine examine how particular theological interpretations compel audiences within specific contexts to act. Contextuality attends both to the historical and societal dimensions of these issues and to the interpretive frameworks brought to biblical text. And finally, the invitation of the rhetor identifies the most compelling argument that can be used to persuade people who hold the opposing theological perspective. Although this case study focuses on theological education, this pedagogical approach has broader implications for other educational settings. Ultimately, rhetorical theology as a pedagogical praxis functions as a bridge-building practice that cultivates understanding among those who hold deeply divergent beliefs about gender, sexuality, and theology. And so I want to go over this pedagogical praxis. And so in my class that I teach at Christian Theological Seminary, it's gender, sexuality, and theology. I assign the students a rhetorical theology paper as their final assignment. And the students have to choose a debated topic related to gender, sexuality, and theology that they would like to engage in their ministerial context. Topics can include, but are not limited to, homosexuality, transgender folks, women in the pulpit, polyamory, masturbation, premarital sex, gender roles, and gender expression. The paper must argue at least two opposing perspectives on the debated topic, and each perspective must include the four assumptions of rhetorical theology. That's faithful persuasion, implications of doctrine, contextuality, and the invitation of the rhetor. So collectively as a class, we engage in example, and we basically walk through rhetorical theology. And so next I'll walk through this rhetorical theology process when we consider the idea of homosexuality. So if we choose homosexuality, then the dialogue begins with two theological points of contention. Homosexuality is a sin, and homosexuality is not a sin. Subsequently, the faith persuasion of rhetorical theology argues each theological perspective with vigor in an attempt to persuade the audience to believe that particular perspective. The faithful persuasion will include biblical scripture that supports each opposing perspective. So for many Christians who believe homosexuality is a sin, they use the clobber text to justify this perspective. So the clobber texts are passages within with a certain biblical interpretation used to condemn homosexuality. They include Genesis 19, where we have Sodom and Gomorrah. We have Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, which talks about an abomination. Romans 1:26 through 27, that talks about what's natural versus what's unnatural. 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, where we have Paul who lists sinful behaviors, and 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10, where Paul lists sin again. So the students would not have to examine all of these texts, but definitely one or two to quote unquote prove that homosexuality is a sin based on biblical interpretation. On the opposing side, homosexuality is not a sin. The students might discuss scriptures regarding the Imago Dei from Genesis 1, 26 through 27, or love from John 13:34, where John talks about a new command of love. We also have Romans 13:10 that talks about love does no harm. Also in Acts chapter 8:27, the Ethiopian eunuch presents as a gender non-conforming person that receives the Holy Spirit. Some students might also include some alternative biblical interpretations of the clobber text. And so that might include Randall Bailey's article, Why Do Readers Believe Lot? Genesis 19 Reconsidered, where he talks about the tradition of hospitality in antiquity and the sexual abuse of women, specifically Lot's daughters. So next, the students will address the implications of doctrine on both sides. And for those that believe homosexuality is a sin, the implications include conversion therapy, church hurt, and harmful theology that is contrary to the person's authentic self. Specifically with concepts such as conversion therapy, students must talk about the proven scientific research around the harm of such methods. Since rhetorical theology allows students to suspend the notion of truth, students cannot name implications that imply truth, such as the prevention of persons from going to hell or the encouragement of right relationship with God. However, one can argue the promotion of heteronormative families as an implication of doctrine. On the opposing side, affirming homosexuality, students might discuss the implications of doctrine, such as sexual expression or sexual confusion, the exploration or the ability for same-gender loving folks to build a relationship with God, believing that they are loved unconditionally. You can also say that that homosexuality is not a sin, encourages homosexual relationships and lifestyles. So the implications of doctrine can be both positive and negative, but must not assign absolute truth to either theological perspective. Regarding the contextuality, the students consider the historical, societal, and or political context of the theological perspective. So in this section, for the opposing perspective of homosexuality, students might discuss the fact that the word homosexual or homosexuality did not appear in biblical translations until 1946. So they could research the rhetorical situation that led to this change in translations. Additionally, the students might engage the socio-political perspective of the Republican Party aligning with conservative Christians to make certain theological beliefs one-vote issues beginning in the 1970s with Pastor Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority Movement. You know, one-vote issues include homosexuality, abortion, and others. Politically, students might also discuss Proposition 8, in California that banned same-sex marriage by defining marriage between a man and a woman in 2008. Now, in support of homosexuality, students might discuss pride and the LGBTQIA rights movement, including the Stonewall riots in 1969. Also, students might discuss marriage equality and the Supreme Court decision that guaranteed the constitutional right to marry same-sex couples. And also from a church denominational context, students might discuss the denominational stances on homosexuality, specifically if they are in these particular denominations. So the UCC, the United Church of Christ, and the Presbyterian Church USA and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ all affirm homosexuality. Conversely, the United Methodist Church have split over the issue. Lastly, considering the invitation of the rhetor, remember that this assignment is to encourage critical thinking. And so to do so, the invitation of the rhetor in the paper is to persuade the opposition of the theological perspective. The students answer one question for both perspectives, and that question is, what is the most compelling aspect of the rhetorical theology that can be used to persuade the other side? And for those that oppose homosexuality, the most compelling argument might be the historical biblical interpretation, considering the tradition of that belief. And for those that affirm homosexuality, the most compelling argument could be the demonstration of Christian principles of love, or possibly the reinterpretation of Scripture. Now, my students struggled with this paper. So after submitting the rhetorical theology papers, we have a discussion about this process of how this process was for them to write the papers. Now, for many of the students, this was the first time to critically reflect on personal theology, public policy, and the implication on real lives. Many struggled with the harm attributed to theological belief as early career ministers and counselors in training. Additionally, when we think of theological education, there are many second and third career students. The students that were former journalists and lawyers and ex-evangelicals found it easier to grasp the concept of rhetorical theology. Former journalists are skilled at not choosing sides. Therefore, the assignment presented the opportunity to present the facts of both sides of the argument. Lawyers are trained to argue their side and also anticipate the argument of the opposing side. And evangelicals were indoctrinated in the conservative religious ideology, and so they were quite familiar with the conservative perspectives on issues. And now these ex-evangelicals hold more progressive theological views, so they understood both theological perspectives for the assignment. Students in the LGBTQIA+ community were able to grasp the concept if in real life they were able to extend persons grace and empathy to theological perspectives contrary to their lived realities. Students who were entrenched on either side of the theological debate struggled with this assignment because they found it difficult to suspend their notion of truth. After resubmitting a paper, one student who was entrenched in a particular understanding of truth surprisingly asked the most profound question. He asked, "How do we honor the complexities of faith?" Now, this student's arrival at this question affirmed that rhetorical theology as a pedagogical praxis engenders empathy and critical thinking around the politics of sex and sexuality. Thank you.
All right. I was sitting back here. I read back. I thought we had some more. That was good. All right.
I wanted to make sure we had time for conversation.
Oh, yes. Wonderful. So let me open it up to questions and comments. Awesome.
I'll start, Dr. Johnson. I'll start. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Dr. Gibson, go right ahead.
Yes. I want to note that she is a graduate of the Christian Theological Seminary.
And what is so special? What is so special about that seminary?
Ph.D. in African American preaching and sacred writing. I just want to let y'all know, just in case.
What is so special about that seminary, though?
Right. Listen, Nicole. We walked across the stage together. You did an amazing job. I really have nothing other than you need to help me with what I'm going through at my church right now. And I'll text you offline for that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great job.
Thank you.
William Burgess, go right ahead, and then Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. McDonald. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was in great anticipation for your talk and really enjoyed it. I have a chapter in my dissertation, which I finished last fall, on rhetorical theology itself. So, and Jeremiah Wright's National Press Club speech. So would love to talk to you more offline about this. I think a lot of what you talk about with rhetorical theology is so profound, and certainly it makes for great understandings of being able to understand revelatory spaces and revelatory politics and, societal issues. And certainly your work around that you described around, the LGBTQ TIA community and, queer and gender studies is certainly a part of that. My question is, one of the things that I think ways people often dismiss rhetorical theology is to argue that it's not serious because it doesn't have that systematic foundation. I'm just wondering if you could kind of just talk a little bit about, kind of ways to respond to that critique that rhetorical theology isn't serious because it doesn't have a systematic foundation the way some other systematic theologies or dogmatic theologies have.
Yeah, I would say that we have to remember that systematic theology is Eurocentric, period. And we are not, I am not concerned with Eurocentric grounding in any of my work. And so in the larger paper, I do talk about how marginalized communities, our theology is contextual versus the Eurocentric. And so I think in the bigger picture, I'm going to argue that all theologies are contextual, and I'm going to take some of Trump's rhetoric and the, white nationalism and talk about that contextuality. And so you cannot, if all theology is contextual, you can't dismiss rhetorical theology.
I love that response. Thank you.
Okay, Jessica, and then Evan.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. McDonald. It was wonderful. I loved it. Yay. Fabulous. I want to thank you for emphasizing the clobber texts. They rarely get named that way, so explicitly, right? They tend to be sort of snuck in someplace as some sort of rationale for ridiculousness. So I appreciate, and lots of harm, lots of harm. I appreciate your emphasis of that. So I'm living just south of Denver, and I have a lot of ex-evangelicals who come up to the big city from the Springs, from these Colorado communities who have never experienced anything other than this white American evangelicalism that we are often so counter to. And about 10 years ago, they started asking me how to take apart this theology they were calling complementarianism, which I'd never heard of before, right? I was like, I can read and write Greek, and I have no idea what you're talking about. So looking it up, I realized this was the predecessor to this severe gender binary theology that they're bringing with them into this white nationalist theology. And for me personally, for me theologically, and in the communities with which I work, Imago Dei has been this, again, thank you for bringing this back into the conversation as well, is this beautiful idea, because a plural God names humanity in all of these things that we see of as humanity, right? And I am asking if you have some good insights or some good resources where I could mine to, instead of just be like, this isn't what the Hebrew means, like that's not often helpful, right? Particularly for Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and younger millennials who have zero biblical literacy except for what they've been fed. They've rejected it. That's why they're ex-evangelicals. They've left those communities. They've come into the big city. They have queer friends. They can grasp that they were mistaught. But complementarianism is blasphemy against Imago Dei, and I just need more resources to help fight that fight. So any insights you might offer, I would be greatly appreciative of.
I can't think of any right now, but I'm gonna write your question down and see what I can come up with. But I've had, when you talk about the Imago Dei, and I didn't know this, but I learned that the Imago Dei has been used against trans folks. Right? And so also in this work, what I'm trying to do with the Imago Dei is remove it from the anthropologic perspective and move it towards an ontological, like that spark of the divine inside, rather than gender-based Imago Dei.
That's good. Evan, welcome, man.
How's it going?
All right.
Yeah, so I had a quick question. I wonder what the impact of, because I still see that the church is wrestling with this idea of affirmation, and that a lot of, I'm seeing, so like I write articles about Christianity for Medium sometimes, and I see this in these online spaces that um, you get a lot of reaction videos from people who do identify as queer, that are uncomfortable with these sermons where you're supposed to, come down very hard on just various members of the LGBTQIA community. And I was wondering if like what the impact of, I guess, currently, like as things stand, shutting our doors to those people would be upon this generation.
Yeah, I think we've already seen the impact with the younger generations like not showing up in the Black church, right? Because again, they see the hypocrisy of how can you talk about justice and hold the line at queer folks when, you know, I have nieces and nephews, they actually have kids in their classes with two moms and two dads. So that's probably the impact. And because of some of the other conversation earlier in this conference, you know, I wonder if there's a connection between the one vote, Jerry Falwell, and all of that. Because the issue with by them putting that in the limelight, the hypocrisy is, well, Black Christians believe the same thing, right? And so though I don't believe we are voting that way, but are we? And is there data to suggest that Black Christians are in fact also voting in these conservative evangelical one vote issues? That's what I'm looking to study more in, the data related to the impact of this.
Good.
So thank you for your question.
Jackie.
Hi.
Hey.
Well, I don't go to CTS, is it? But you are a chaplain and I'm a fellow chaplain. So I feel that connection. I think you did a marvelous job. And I like that you're having the students to be able to choose and do the research for themselves, and that they can actually see the pain that is being caused. One of the things that I often ask individuals when I'm doing my assessment on them is, do they have any spiritual hurt or pain that they want to discuss or work on while they're with their time with me? And so I think it is a big thing. And oftentimes it is the LGBTQ community. And the stereotypes around Baptists per se, because I'm Baptist, so they ask me my denomination and I share. And Black Baptists have like a really bad reputation regarding LGBTQ. So people are often shocked when I'm presenting myself and just open and being affirming and caring for them for who they are. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done for sure for the Black church in general, because it is seen as we are super conservative. Right. And I don't know that everybody's in that boat.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent job.
Thank you.
Look around. Any more questions, comments?
I do. Thank you.
Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald. And I see Jackie purchased, pre-ordered, but I didn't ask. Okay, so I did see that it came under my name. So I'm going to have to order one in her name just so that you get two. But thank you so much. And I wish that you were my instructor while I was in seminary, which was, of course, in a different century, because this is where the rubber is meeting the road as I pastor too. And so just a bit of a preamble. So that we have been historically a don't ask, don't tell church. And for whatever reasons, but it's coming to a head because even beyond the fact that openly gay people can serve at our church, just not be fully disclosive. There is someone in my ministry who is answering a call to preach, and I'm fully supportive of that. And so this is especially timely for me because my contention is not about whether this person is Christian or called, or how to prepare this person to enter into ordained ministry. It is really about the intergenerational fight that I've got to wage. And it is, help me with this, because I really do have this, I'm a scholar, I'm an intellectual on this matter. And so I'm conversant with biblical languages and theology, and I consider myself to be progressive. So when I hear the arguments about it, I have almost disdain about the arguments against people who are LGBTQIA. And I don't know how to do this without coming across like that. And so so help me in that regard, in using perhaps some of your scholarship and others, how as a pastor I can help promote, help support, help be an ally, help advance create the space for someone to live out their authentic being and their call, while also helping bring our people in our congregation along, which I think generally speaking may be a minority of people, but those persons still are important.
Yeah. So from a scholarly point, I point you to my article, The Persona of the Humble Teacher. You can get that. And from a pastoral perspective, go on the website, go on YouTube and look at Howard John Wesley's Bible study on sex, sexuality, and scripture. And basically what he did in this Bible study, which I talk about in my article, is basically, his rhetorical situation is, I don't want my church to split because of this issue. And I have gay parents who have children, and their children are being disrespected in this church, right? And so he uses that to tee up this Bible study where he does this rhetorical theology, where he basically says the church has to live with difference, that we don't have to agree on this issue and we can stay unified, right? And so he challenges his congregation of, if the LGBTQIA plus community in this church do not feel loved, what are we doing? Are we really, acting in the Christian value of love? And so he challenges the congregation in that matter. And when he goes through this Bible study, he brings in, Hebrew Bible folks and New Testament folks, and he talks about it on like all the sides, right? He talks about every angle. And so you're thinking and listening, but he also, and this is what I talk about in my article, he also gives boundaries of safety for the congregation. Like, hey, we're not changing our Constitution. Now, he was in a little different place than you. He doesn't have any queer clergy folks trying to come through the line, as far as I know. So he places boundaries for the congregation so that they won't be fearful, like, oh, you're changing us into a gay church and all of that. He places boundaries. He talks about the boundaries. And then he goes through this rhetorical theology process. And it's my understanding that what ended up happening was that queer folks are allowed to serve in leadership now, right? But he did not present this is where we're going. It was a more of an inductive approach to teaching, and let's talk about all the different sides. And he admitted to being in his early career saying that that there's no such thing as a gay Christian. That's on record. It's in an interview somewhere. And he talks about through relationships with people, his theological perspective has shifted. And then he also talks about the difference between his pastoral theology and a personal theology, which I really don't, that's a little shaky for me, but he does the work, and he was able to make some steps in a more positive direction for the LGBT community.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald.
Yep,
Thank you so much.
And that article that she's mentioning, I put a link in the chat, but it's in JCR, the Journal of Communication and Religion, and it can be easily obtained. And if not, I'm sure that we can get you a copy. Let's see, Daniel and Mariah, you next. Go, Daniel.
Well, first, I really appreciate the approach. I have 3 elementary age daughters, and we've talked about how their piano teacher is moving from Nebraska to another state because of she and her wife want to start a family, and how that's not fair that they have to move to be able to do that. And I think that kind of a conversation is really helpful. One of the things that struck me as you were speaking was that there's some inadvertent things that we end up doing that add to that oppressive nature. And I can't help but think about how ableism might fit into this, in the way that sometimes we pray for healing for people, and sometimes deny who someone is. And so I don't know if maybe you can speak a little bit to that, if maybe some of your students have used that as an example within their rhetoric and the work they're doing.
Yeah, that's good. I've never even thought of it from an ableism perspective and the idea of healing, but I think that's kind of what conversion therapy, centers, right? That, you need healing from, this behavior and whatnot. So I haven't thought about it, but thank you. That's good. That's a good perspective. Yep, absolutely. Weaponizing prayer.
All right, Reverend Dr. McIntosh.
All right, Dr. McDonald.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Have you ever heard of a person by the name of Don Abram? He heads an organization called Pride in the Pew.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of Pride in the Pew.
In Cincinnati. Yeah. He presented earlier at the Louisville Seminary's Black Church Studies consultation. And I found interesting that he was talking about a thing called the institutional church continuum. 5 different types of churches and how they interact with the LGBTQIA. And he lists 5 of them: antagonizing, avoiding, accepting, affirming, and lastly, advocating. A lot of us work towards being affirming, but he takes it a step further and wants advocating, where the social and civil issues that affect our LGBTQIA, that the advocating church is demanding on their behalf. And so he has done some excellent work in the area, not just in the faith community, but socially overall. And just wondering if you had known of him, and hey, I'd like to see the 2 of you put a book together.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I've heard of Pride in the Pew, but not necessarily his work. And so I'll definitely look it up and look up his work and see how I can incorporate that. And maybe there is a conversation that needs to be had. So thank you.
All right. All right, let me look. I don't see any more hands up. This is wonderful. This is so good. And thank you, Dr. McDonald, for bringing up rhetorical theology. And again, if we would understand and begin to understand, rather, that, the theologies that we claim are the right ones, it just fell from the sky. And it just hit us the right way. The early Christian church theology started in small communities with communication, with dialogue, with disagreement, with argument. Dare I even say rhetoric? and we know what happens, who wins the argument, what happens to them, and who loses the argument, what happens to them and their writings and stuff. So what rhetorical theology does, at least for me, is offer us an opportunity to reinterpret where we have come from, what we have been taught, what have we have been shared, and be open to the Spirit and to our own inward journeys and to our own senses, and able to articulate. And I think Dr. McDonald is doing a wonderful job in her class and bringing that pedagogical example of rhetorical theology. So one more time, y'all, Dr. Nicole McDonald.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, it is lunchtime. We're going to go and get a bite and do all the stuff, but we will be back at 1:30 Central Time, that's 2:30 Eastern, with our third panel. I see that a couple of the panelists are already in the Zoom room, so we are looking forward to that. And then, of course, we have a full panel a little bit later on at 3 o'clock. But for right now, let's take our break and we'll come back 1:30.